Welcome to Lesson 6. Today we're going to be talking about workflow and revisiting some of the shortcuts that we've learned so far. The biggest difference between novice and amateur producers isn't necessarily an understanding of what FL Studio can do, but rather how to manipulate FL Studio quickly to achieve a goal. Today, we'll nail down these basics to help us as we progress down the road of production, and additionally, this lesson is the last time we're going to be using Miriam First Beat. You can open that project now, but remember that you don't need to make a beat along with me to understand these concepts. It just helps to solidify them. Now, let's get into it. The first handy practice is to detach windows that you would like to view while you're working on something else. Detaching a window involves going up to this menu here and clicking on the detached function. Now, we can take this window and we can move it around, resize it, and it's no longer confined to this gray area inside of FL Studio. We can put it anywhere and even take it off screen over to another monitor if we have one. This is very useful if we're working with two windows at once, or if we have a dual monitor display and we want to put something on one screen and then keep the rest of FL Studio on the other. Next up is the organization of the content inside of the windows. In our first 5 videos, we did our best to keep the concepts and actions simple to give you a better understanding of how music moves through FL Studio. Now we're going to revisit this flow and these windows with vital tips to staying organized. First, every place that holds notes and audio or effects data can be renamed and colored. This might seem trivial at first, but as projects grow, coloring and accurately naming become absolutely necessary to stay organized. Starting at the channel rack, which we can open with our F6 shortcut, let's go to the kick channel, right-click, and then press R to open up the rename and recoloring options. Normally we wouldn't have to rename this channel, but for the sake of practice we will, so let's call it kick drum. Now let's click here on this little color tab and select something. I'm going with purple. So if you've been following our series for a little while, you'll remember that last time we split up our first pattern into different patterns that each contained an individual channel. So we had a kick, clap, hat, and snare pattern that we made out of our original. Now, let's try and actually reorganize those so that they're not just sitting on top of one another inside of our first track. I'm going to take our piano pattern and move it down to the 5th track, and then I'm going to lay the hat, snare, and clap all on their own tracks. If you notice, they're vertically aligned, so they'll still be playing at the same time. But now that we've separated them, we have a little more control. Going back to the channel rack, using that F6 shortcut, maybe we want to have groups of channels or groups of patterns that we put together and can manipulate all at once. Thankfully, we can do this with the grouping functions that are in the channel rack. What we're going to do is we're going to hold down Shift and then left-click on each individual channel that we want in a group. Here I'm clicking on everything that has to do with drums. We're going to click on the channel rack's menu button, and then we're going to go down to Group Selected. We can click here or press the G key. Now we're going to give them a name. I'm going to go with drums. And now we can pick out of our groups in the channel rack our drum group. Additionally, we can color this group all in one fell swoop. We're going to make sure that we've still selected this group here, and then we're going to color selected. We're going to choose gradient. Now this means that you could have one color fade into the next on the buttons, but I'm not a fan of that, so I'm just going to be clicking purple twice. Now, within our channel rack, all of our drum group is colored the same, so they're easier to identify. Finally, when we're looking at channels within the channel rack, if we want to move them around so that we can keep our groups closer together or just stay better organized, we select the channel that we want to move, hold down Alt, and then use our up or down arrow keys to put the channel where we want it. Now let's move into the playlist, where most of the functionality is the same. If you right-click and press R on a track, then you can rename and recolor it. Let's do that now to our kick drum and make it purple once again. To move this track, somewhat similar to the functionality within the channel rack, we're going to select it, hold down Shift, and scroll. This way, we can get our tracks organized properly within the playlist. To group a track with the track above it, we right-click on the track, and then we can press G or select this here. Now these two tracks are part of a group that will move together. This is again helpful when you're trying to group together similar tracks, patterns, or sounds. Now that we've put 2 of the drum tracks together, let's group the remaining 2. Again, we're going to right click and press the G button, or we're going to click here. Simple enough. Now that we've grouped these together, let's auto-color the group itself. We do that by right-clicking on the color that we want to color the entire group by, and then selecting Auto Color Group. Wouldn't you know it, we now have our group auto-colored. Now, we did something here that's out of order, but I did it to illustrate a point. Let's say that we want to save even more time, and we want to name these tracks after the patterns that are inside of them. Well, we can right-click on them, and then we can choose Auto Name. Well, if we do that, now all of a sudden we're taking the color from this same clip, which wasn't what we wanted to do. So in future, we're going to want to auto-name our tracks first, and then we're going to auto-color the group second. Now, let's recolor our pattern data so that both patterns and clips are colored and that they're the same as the tracks that we already colored. Again, this is going to help us in organization. So we're going to right-click on the pattern, press R to rename or recolor, we'll keep the name, and then color accordingly. We can do this all the way down, but for the sake of time, I won't make you watch me do all of this. The next thing that's very important to our workflow and that can frustrate a lot of beginners is understanding the complexity of the snap settings that FL Studio has. So snap settings essentially say that if you draw a pattern or any kind of data, how does it move in the playlist? As you can see, this clip is moving according to half a step at a time. I can't get it in between that area, and it's always very precisely moving half a step when I click and drag it. So, to have an influence on this, what we're going to need to do is 2 things. 1, we need to check on the global snap settings that we have for all of FL Studio. We almost always want this to be set to none. Then, we're going to go to the snap settings for the playlist and choose what we want. I usually use something between a half a beat or a beat, but you can use whatever you'd like. Notice, however, if we go to none and we drag, now all of a sudden we can put this clip wherever we want. This can be nice if we're moving things fluidly, but if we're trying to be precise and replicate a pattern throughout a song that's in time with the beat, we're going to want this to move better. So, now let's change our snap settings back to a half step. Well, we have them here on half step, and we can see the little snaps, but because our clip wasn't fully aligned beforehand, it's not fully aligning now that we've even created this snap setting. So I'm going to go back to half beat instead, which is even coarser, and I'm going to move it all the way to the left, which will realign it with the snap settings so that we can get it right on a line. And voila, we have our clip where we want it. One last tip for moving things within the playlist is, let's say that we have a clip and we don't want to change the snap settings, but for now we do want to move it by some increment that the snap setting isn't allowing. If we hold down Alt and then click and drag, we disable snap settings while Alt is held down. This can be very helpful. But again, snap settings usually will guide us to the appropriate place for a clip. The next thing that we're going to look at is the mixer. But first, let's pull up the channel rack to double check that all of our channels are being sent to different mixer inserts. This is important to stay organized. Now, let's head on over to the mixer with our F9 shortcut and take a peek. Well, as we look at this now, we can see that none of these mixer inserts are colored. So let's try and fix that. We're going to right click here, and then we're going to go to change color. We can click purple, and then we can also rename and give it the appropriate name for the channel that is being sent to this mixer insert. Now let's really start firing on all cylinders. With the channel rack and mixer both detached so we can see them both, we're going to select the next channel, and then we're going to go to the mixer, right click on it, go to channel routing, and then select route selected channels to this track. Now we just saved ourselves the entire step of linking the channel to the insert, recoloring the insert, and renaming the insert. Again, we can do this for any of our inserts, but we just have to make sure that we click on the proper channel beforehand. Otherwise, we're going to get lost in the shuffle. The last thing we'll talk about during our workflow lesson today is your CPU. which is incredibly important to keep an eye on. CPU stands for Central Processing Unit, and it's essentially a measurement of how many tasks your computer can run at the same time and still work at an acceptable speed. FL Studio is a really heavy program, and so if you're working on a normal computer like I am, then you're going to want to make sure that FL has only the necessary pieces running, because if you overload it, it can freeze or crash, which will result in a loss of project progress. Keeping a low CPU shouldn't be too hard for a beginner, but basic best practice should still be followed. First of all, you can see your CPU usage up here as to how overloaded it's getting and how much memory you're using up in FL Studio at a given moment. A couple of ways that you can make sure to keep your CPU usage as low as possible is by making sure that any note, clip, or MIDI data that you have that's not being used in the song or pattern should be deleted. Further, unused patterns must be cleared out from both the channel rack and the current project, as well as the pattern window on the left side of the playlist. Lastly, if you have an insert that has a lot of plugins, try and get one or more of those plugins to sound exactly as you would like it, then record the sound coming out of that insert as pure audio, and then delete the plugins and the channel, and instead have that recorded audio play through the insert itself. It'll sound the same and take up a lot less CPU, and we'll demonstrate how to do this in our recording lesson later on. That wraps it up for our coverage on basic workflow. If you scroll down to the description in this video, you'll be able to see plenty of shortcuts that we've outlined for you that are especially helpful to beginners, so I very much so advise that you give those a look. We'll see you on the flip side, and for now, this is Miriam Music, signing off.